It's my pleasure to introduce United States Air Force Major General retired Charles J. Dunlap, Jr. He's currently the Executive Director of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at Duke Law School, where he's also a professor of practice of law, I should say. From Philadelphia, and like myself, he is a proud graduate of St. Joe's University, go Hawks, and he has a law degree from Villanova, which must create some disloyalty during the basketball season, although now he's down at Duke. So
there's no disloyalty.
General Dunlap he served a 34-year career, served overseas in both Korea and the United Kingdom, and deployed for military operations in Africa and the Middle East. He's a distinguished graduate of the National War College, which is where, in fact, he wrote a very famous article, infamous to some people, in the 1990s called "The Coming Military Coup of 2012." It's now 2015. It hasn't happened, but he did point to a lot of trends. He did point to a lot of trends that were happening at the time about the expanded use of the military domestically and other places. And ironically, the first time I met, he was then Colonel Dunlap. We were at a meeting in Baltimore, a panel on civil-military relations, where it was Charlie Moscos, a late great military sociologist at Northwestern, Russell Weigley, late great military historian from Temple, and Samuel Huntington, a late great political scientist from Harvard University. And Professor Huntington introduced his remarks by talking about this brash colonel talking about a coup. But he had obviously not read the article, because if he had, he would have seen that it would track very well with the soldier in the state and his prescriptions there. So it's a bit ironic. But ever since then, it's been a privilege to know General Dunlap. He has over 100 publications, and we look forward to his comments today. Thank you, General.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mike for that gracious introduction. You forgot to add, though, I'm a legend in my own mind. So that's what I tell my students. And in fact, when I tell them that I served 34 years, they kind of stare at me, and you can almost see the wheels turning in their heads, like, how old is this guy? Is he going to make it through the course? Do I have to drop it and get somebody maybe with better prospects? And I really want to say thanks to my friend Steve Laddick for switching with me. We discovered this morning that the car to take me to the airport is coming at 11:35 or 11:30, and I wasn't due to be done until 12:45. So that was a little bit of a logistical. But as we say in the Air Force, flexibility is the key to air power. Do ethics matter? This has kind of come up before in this. In fact, I think in Tony's presentation, we had a question along this line. Well, according to the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, it does, because it relates importantly to public confidence. In other words, the ethics of the armed forces. And I do think it is important, given that we have an all-volunteer force. You know, right now, I think the AVF benefits from the fact that the armed forces is the entity in society in which the public has most confidence. Speaking of civil-military relations, it's interesting that the public has more confidence in the military than in the Supreme Court and the President and Congress and everyone else who's supposed to exercise control over the armed forces. But do ethics matter in warfighting? I've been talking about the relationship of law and ethics for some time, and I've always believed, as Professor Jeffrey Best in his classic, that there is a relationship between ethics and law. Law, though, represents, in my mind, the minimum public agreement of what the ethical norm should be. You know, there are lots of definitions of the relationship of ethics and law, and that would be one. I talked about something I call lawfare, because I think that in the 21st century, and in fact in the 20th century, we're now seeing law and indeed ethics being weaponized by adversaries. We can use it as well, but law and I would argue ethics is being weaponized. This is the way adversaries are looking at it. And this is, some people know Bill Eckhart. He was one of the prosecutors in the My Lai massacre. And just let me have one segue here. One of the most important things about what you all do is reflected in the need in this country to teach history, and especially military history. Bill Eckhart, as I mentioned, was one of the prosecutors of the My Lai massacre. At Duke Law School, when I teach law of armed conflict, and I ask the students if they've ever heard of My Lai, it's much less than 20%. And I was telling somebody, you know that classic picture from Kent State where the girl is, less than 20% have ever seen that photo before. And less than 10% have ever seen that famous photo from My Lai massacre where the bodies are in the ditch. And so I think we have it, and this is important no matter what somebody does with the rest of their life. I think to be a citizen in this country, it's extremely important. And Bill goes on and puts it in military terms. Center of gravity is a military term, and adversaries are looking at it. We could have a whole presentation on lawfare because we can use it as well. But nevertheless, I think the reality is that in a democratic society, if the society comes to the conclusion that the war is being waged in the wrong way, and I think we've heard, I think Tony alluded to it, John yesterday alluded to it, and this is very Clausewitzian, I would suggest as well. I always tell my students the worst defeat that the military has suffered since 9/11 was essentially an ethical and legal failure. And it did have, as I think one of our speakers yesterday said, I think it was maybe Paul, this did have a real operational effect. In fact, General Sanchez very interestingly used traditional military language to describe the impact of it, even though no soldiers were killed, no shots were fired per se. It had that kind of effect. So let's take a look at the first issue, drones. The drone is not the thing in the foreground, it's the thing in the background. My students get confused about that, those that are awake. I put this to pimp my good friend Paul about aircraft. He actually knew about this. He's forgotten more about the capture and the history of it, but it has happened. People have surrendered to aircraft. And, maybe in the future we will see more of this with drones, especially when drones are right here, flying right here and telling you better surrender or I'm going to go right into your brain. And if we think that's science fiction, I think we'd be wrong. It has been, widely used and I think very discreetly used, and we're going to talk about that. There's lots of RPAs, other word, remotely piloted vehicles, and there's probably 10,000 in the military's inventory. Vast majority of them are just for surveillance. There's only a few hundred that are armed. And we've heard of the Predator. The Predator carries a Hellfire missile, which was originally designed to attack tanks in the Fulda Gap. It has a camera on it, and it allows this precision strike. It's very complicated. People don't realize this, but it takes about 200 people to support a drone flying in Afghanistan today. There's also another system called the Reaper, and it's much bigger than the Predator, and it's about the size of an F-16. But you have to remember that both these armed drones are like, in terms of their capabilities as aircraft, they're like World War II aircraft. In other words, they can only operate in a permissive environment. If the enemy has even a third world air force, they can shoot it down. That will become important. And this is from the Guardian newspaper. The Brits have bought the Reaper. And there's two parts of this I want you to remember for later on, because it will become important about how people on the ground don't even know that they're being watched. What's the future? Building super small weapons. And the reason for this is something we heard before, this war amongst the people. We have to have the capability of being able to strike. There's a pretty good video that goes with this. I really can't show it right now, but this weapon has the ability to attack between those two cardboard stanchions and not knock them over. In other words, the opportunity there is to limit collateral damage. What's in the future? Micro-drones. These haven't been weaponized yet, but it's only a matter of time. what about this? What are the ethics of this? Are we stimulating a new global arms race? Actually, Rand has kind of taken a look at that, and I do agree with Dr. Davis on this, that remember I talked about the 200 people to support an armed drone? It's one thing to have a surveillance drone. It's another thing, significantly, to have one that's actually weaponized. We recently saw some announcement that the U.S. is going to export it. Maybe not. And part of the reason has to do with law and ethics. Before anything can be exported in this country, you have to jump through a lot of hoops, including certain agreements and user agreements associated with a weapons transfer. One of which is, and there's another document that details they have to be used in compliance with the law of war, and they can't be used for internal security. And so a lot of people think that countries are going to go to other places, because there's quite a few countries now that are either building or have already built armed drones. So what's the law? International law, I'm going to give you a summary from a very eminent jurist, Charles Krathheimer, because believe it or not, in this article, he summarized it pretty good. He talks about imminent threat. This has to do with self-defense and the concept of anticipatory self-defense. But if you look at Article 51 in the UN Charter, it doesn't seem, it says, oh, no, you can only use self-defense after you've suffered an armed attack. Well, I think the world community has evolved to accept the idea of anticipatory self-defense, but it does require the imminent threat. And there are two kinds of law that's involved here. International human rights law, which is kind of like law enforcement, and then international humanitarian law, which is the law of war, or what I call the law of armed conflict. Most scholars outside the United States call the law of war international humanitarian law. For a lot of philosophical reasons, I never do, and most scholars in this country and practitioners, meaning people in the military, don't call it that. The other basis is status-based targeting, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we look at some of the other. Domestic law, I think Steve may talk about some of these things, and believe me, Steve Laddick's forgotten more about this than I ever knew, and so I'm going to go by that. I am going to mention, and this is on the web, it makes for interesting reading. Steve Preston, who's the DoD General Counsel, gave a speech, and this is a good way where you can catch up and get the U.S. government's position without reading 50 documents, because the way they've revealed their position is through this series of speeches. And Steve's is the latest one, and he talks about self-defense. He talks about the rationale for attacking Syria, and then he makes I think, kind of an interesting statement here that he says that you don't see people challenging the legality of the use of force. And in one sense, he is kind of correct, but I think that there is a lot of dispute as to the factual basis, the factual support for the use of force by the United States. In any event, a common question, haven't you heard this? Is this assassination? Are we assassinating? Well, actually, this language comes from Executive Order 12333, and there is a prohibition on assassination. But what exactly does that word mean? The best discussion, and it's on the web, is by Hayes Parks, and it's about what the word assassination really means. And this is a little summary. Assassination in peacetime is when you kill somebody for political purposes. And as Hayes points out, that's violating international law no matter what. No, that is a prohibition. That's explicitly what 12333 is supposed to prohibit. Assassination in wartime is different, because in wartime, there's legalized killing. And the question here is combatants, in other words, members of an armed force, just because they are members of the armed force, just because they're in that status, can be killed at any time, in any place, even if they're not presenting a threat. In other words, a public affairs officer asleep in her bed at home, completely unarmed, with no access to weapons, can legally have her throat slit in an armed conflict by a lawful combatant. And if you do it to an individual, if you kill an individual who is a bona fide target, a bona fide combatant in wartime, then that is lawful, no matter what. In other words, this is status-based targeting. And it doesn't matter the means that's done, assuming it's otherwise lawful means. There's a good example from World War II when Admiral Yamamoto, in one of the longest aerial missions for, I think they're P-51s, the Japanese code was cracked and they shot down his plane. And it's often talked about in terms of assassination, but really it's just killing another combatant. What about Americans as targets? And I think, Steve, are you going to talk about Kieran as well? Well, let me talk about it. Kieran is the Nazi saboteur case where Nazis came on shore during World War II in Long Island and also in Florida. Well, at least one of these guys, and maybe two of them, were American citizens. And so they were convicted by military commission. And the Supreme Court had this observation about that. If you're fighting for the enemy, you're essentially going to be treated as the enemy like every other enemy. Now, keep in mind, this is not a drone targeting case. This is a military commission case, and people can make arguments about it. 6 of them were executed. But we heard a little bit of discussion about this. Should courts decide? I have a different perspective on this. Let's take a look at what the courts have done. The Alawaki case, this is before he was killed. His father brought a lawsuit, tried to prevent him from being on this target list. And although the case was really decided on standing, that the father didn't have standing to bring the lawsuit, there was also discussion of something called the political question doctrine. And this is what you'll see in a lot of national security cases, that courts don't feel they have the competence. They are not targeteers. They're not equipped to do the evaluation and the intelligence and everything else. They think it's a political question. In other words, something that should be decided by the elected branches of government. This is a later case. This is after Alawaki was killed in Yemen. And this is about his estate in a different case, but the judge kind of came to the same conclusion because, and I think this is right, there are certain kinds of issues related to national security. I think that the elected branch, people who are elected, should be making these decisions, not unelected judges. But obviously other people can disagree with that. U.S. policy. There's this is also on the web, on the White House website, this fact sheet, which was in connection with a speech given by the president at National Defense University. And it was about counterterrorism operations. It wasn't strictly about drones, but that would be one form of counterterrorism operation and outside the active area of hostilities. Now, keep in mind, this is policy, and there are things in here that aren't mandated by law. And in fact, there's been some discussion among that people, this has been unhelpful because it mixes those two kinds of law that we talked about, international human rights law and international law, domestic law, and then straight policy. And I'm going to take a look at a couple of things. The preference for capture. There is no preference for capture under the law of war, legally. Do people want to capture? Yes, because there's always the opportunity to interrogate, but mostly you get to look and see what they have with them. A lot of information comes from what they have with them. We saw in the New York Times last week, there's a front page story about a guy who's now being subject to a trial, and the New York Times raised the issue, well, this, because he had been allegedly on a drone strike list, and they're saying, well, look, now he's before court. And this is one of the things that drives operators crazy. Professor Kaufman, who I don't know, I'm sure is a great guy, he writes this article. He says, see, this shows that it's much easier to capture people than people would have you believe. That doesn't mean, how does he know that? I mean, has he looked at the files of all the people who have been targeted, the highly classified file? I don't think so. You know, just because somebody later on is turned over by the Pakistanis doesn't mean that it's easy to capture these people. And I do disagree with my friend Paul. I've never been involved, I've never heard of anybody saying, okay, we can't put these guys at Gitmo, it'll be hard to prosecute them, ergo, let's kill them. I've never heard that because, quite honestly, the operators, they frankly don't care what problems the lawyers are going to have in dealing with people. That I've never heard that come up in any discussion. Maybe other people have heard that, but I haven't. Taking a look at lethal force is not to be used as a punishment, and this is true under either legal regime. So this is something that everybody would agree with. If you want to punish somebody, you bring them before. If you're using force, it's to protect people and to accomplish a mission. Another senior operational leader. Is this required by the law? No. And it's not required by international human rights law. Because a soldier might tell you, you know, the lowest ranking guy can kill you just as dead as a senior operational leader. But this is a policy decision that our country has made. How about this? Does it make a difference? Well, you guys are the historians. So I do think individuals make a difference. And there's a recent analogy. It isn't a drone case, but this article appeared in the Washington Post about Colombia and how they've managed to tamp down their insurgency. And what they talk about was a specific CIA program that allowed the killing of 24 leaders. In other words, the killing of 24 leaders, at least by this article, was a major reason why the insurgency has been put down. And that was because, allegedly, the CIA provided precision-guided munitions. In other words, kind of the same concept as a drone, but actually from a manned airplane. Looking at this requirement for an imminent threat. Now, you might see continuing imminent threat. Now, if it's imminent, what does continuing have to do with that? It's a little bit of a language difficulty. And honestly, I'm not sure I know. If I was guessing, it might have something to do with, Title 50, a covert action, a finding that the president might have made. I don't know. It doesn't read too well. But here's the thing. The way this works is you don't need to have the imminent threat if it is status-based targeting. So if it's a member of an armed force in which you're at war with, or if it's a member of an organized armed group who's engaged in continuous combat operations. Now, there's dispute as to what's continuous, what's membership, and so forth. Some people, the Red Cross says, no, it needs to be more than membership. You need to be in this organized armed group, and you have to be directly participating in other words, engaging in certain kinds of activities. But then you can be attacked on the same basis as someone in the armed forces. Near certainty. That's not what the law requires. It doesn't require you to be nearly certain. And I can tell you that on battlefields, people don't, restrain the use of force until they're nearly certain that it is the enemy. If, you can't operate that way. It's a basis of reasonableness. This is one that I really think was terribly bad to put in, that the near certainty that no civilians will be killed. This telegraphed to the enemy exactly what they needed to do to avoid being struck. And they have reacted. They have surrounded themselves with civilians, often children. They go to school on everything we put out. And To me, it's pretty obvious. And of course, international law doesn't require it. This is what the law, even though the U.S. is not a party to Additional Protocol 1, some people would say this reflects customary international law. And basically, you do this sort of balancing. But the rule is you can attack, you can know you're going to kill civilians in advance. You can be 100% positive, and it's legal so long as the anticipated military advantage sought doesn't cause excessive civilian casualties. And that's kind of a subjective determination. Recently, the White House got themselves in a little bit of a problem because of the fact sheet that they put out, because people are saying, well, wait a second, you're not nearly certain in these strikes in ISIS. And Ms. Hayden, the spokesperson, had to come out and say, well, that was for outside of active combat areas, and this is an active combat area. But it illustrates the kind of thing that you can get wrapped up with when people try to improve upon international law. Capture not feasible. That is not required by the law of armed conflict. It is required by international human rights law. So if the law of armed conflict doesn't apply, then you would have to have capture not being feasible. But in a conflict with an organized armed group or a nation state, it's up to the person to manifest, to effectively surrender. It's their responsibility. And then we talk about in the president's fact sheet, what about countries where, we're not at war with them? And the U.S. view is reflected in the Attorney General's speech of a couple of years ago, and where he points out that the authority isn't limited to Afghanistan or Iraq, because obviously, Al-Qaeda is in more than one location. And that makes sense, because if you say force is only limited to Iraq and Afghanistan, what are you telling the enemy to do? You're telling the enemy to metastasize into other places where they will have this sanctuary, this legal sanctuary created. And it doesn't mean that force can be used anywhere. There are other prerequisites involved. And when we start talking about consent, everybody likes to talk about Pakistan. Well, guess what? Well, there is these secret documents that allegedly were released. But I have a more practical reason. Remember I told you about the drones and their capabilities? Of all the websites to get support for this proposition, the anti-war website, talk about how the fact of the matter is, the Pakistani Air Force, which has F-16s, by the way, could shoot down every drone the United States launches if they wanted to. They have the capability. They have a very formidable air defense because they're worried about India. But they could stop drones in Pakistan anytime they wanted to. What basis besides consent if a nation is unwilling or unable? This is a good article, and I'm going to put it in a footnote in what I'm preparing for you guys so you can have it, because this, Ashley Deeks' article is pretty much the standard for this. And recently, in relationship to, this is, the unwilling or unable is kind of, disputed in international law, but in relation to ISIS and the use of force against ISIS, it's interesting. After the Iraqi foreign minister asked for support, Ambassador Power, our ambassador to the United Nations, put in a letter which Article 51 requires, the self-defense, and this is collective self-defense with Iraq, and citing this unwilling or unable standard. And the interesting thing is the Secretary General of the United Nations gave some real support for that. He almost mirrored that language, which I thought was interesting. And then no reasonable alternatives. This is important if you're acting under international human rights law, in the sense of if you're looking for imminence. One of the elements of imminence is that of anticipatory self-defense is you have to exhaust all other kinds of opportunities. And it's not required by the law of war, but it is required by international human rights. Does the process work? Well, I thought this was kind of interesting. This article came out about 2 weeks ago in Foreign Affairs, and it talks about documents that were found in Osama bin Laden's lair. And it would suggest, it provides from the enemy, so to speak, some evidence that it is working kind of as reflected in what the president's speech. Okay, let's talk about some of the controversy. Americans are wildly supportive of this. And in fact, when you look at this poll, most Americans want more drone strikes. Dunlap's theory on this is they rather see a drone strike than a 19-year-old boots on the ground or coming back in a casket. And they're pretty comfortable with it. What does the world think? Well, actually, the world, I think Kenya and Israel are the only, I don't know why Kenya, countries in the world think drone strikes are good. I think the Brits do too, like by some narrow. But interesting, and they also hate our surveillance program. The interesting thing is, despite those two things, in this same poll, 65% of the people in the 40 countries or whatever surveyed have a favorable view of the United States, notwithstanding their disagreement. Are drones cowardly? This actually came up in some congressional testimony. David Kilcullen, one of the minds behind the counterinsurgency strategy, hates the idea of technology getting ahead of what his theories were. He talked about this. You know, he said to the Taliban, it looks cowardly and weak. I'm not sure I care. I really don't. I mean, look at who these guys are. I don't care what they think. I care the fear, and we saw the fear in the stuff from Osama bin Laden's lair. In addition, do I need to worry about not looking manly to the Taliban? These are the people who are shooting a 14-year-old girl in the head because she wants to get an education. Do RPAs give us an unfair advantage? In this month's issue of the Carnegie Council on Ethics, there's a whole thing about drones. This guy writes this article in there. He basically says, you know, it's really not fair that, you know, the U.S. has drones and, you know, they don't have any way of defending themselves. They've lost their autonomy. I'm thinking, you know, what planet are we on? Because it's like saying, oh, we're about to defeat the Nazis. We have to let them catch up so that, you know, it's a fair fight. You know, so they have a good chance of winning because that's what ethics require. Well, actually, in war, it isn't about fairness. It's about following the law and ethics, but it's not about fairness in that sense. And I'm kind of a Pantonian in this respect. I'm not so concerned, you know, about giving the enemy a fair opportunity to resist drones. How about this? I would suggest the answer is yes, because I think David killed Goliath with a missile weapon, a standoff missile weapon. And I think the longbowmen in Agincourt defeated the Flower of French nobility with a standoff missile weapon. And I think during the Gulf War, our tanks outranged Iraqi tanks and our weapons outranged theirs. Since the beginning of warfare, combatants have always looked for ways of engaging the adversary in a way that the adversary can't bring to bear his weapons. Have you heard this? This came from Philip Alston. I don't know Philip Alston other than by reputation, but this is unbelievably offensive. This may be way that he thinks himself that if he were a drone pilot, he would have a PlayStation mentality. And he put this in an official UN report, but that's not the way it really works. And I think there's a great article. I'm only going to show you a little bit of it, but it gives you how this works. These guys study these targets for hundreds of hours. They get to, and on a big high-definition screen, they get to know them, and it's extremely personal kind of thing. I've never met anybody actually involved in these operations who thought it was a PlayStation kind of thing. They know the difference of what they're doing. And I think it's just offensive that in a UN report, that's why people in this country don't support the UN. Anyway, not that I'm getting all wrapped up about this. This is Dunlap's theory. There are certain primordial fears that can be tapped into. We see it with chemical weapons. And I think the same thing happens with drones because people have a fear of being hunted. There's actually psychological, and oh gosh, the thing is Nathan, the predator, it is capitalizing on that. Do they cause, and let's take another look at one of the excessive casualties. I picked the Bureau of Investigative Journalism because they are the most hostile, A, to anything American, B, to drones. And take a look at the number. Let me go back one. 2013, 2014, 2015, Yemen. That's not what the popular narrative is at all. And this isn't New America Foundation or any of the other people who gathered this is the most hostile, in my judgment, organization towards drones. Go on their website and you'll see how hostile they are. Anyway, the effect. We talked about this. Dunlap's view on this is it's way more complex because when you look at for example, from Afghanistan, and this has been historically true, 75% of the casualties have been caused by anti-government elements, which means the Taliban and al-Qaeda. But it really hasn't had much of an effect on the Afghanis. I think it has, and Tony, I was going to bring this up in your presentation, I think the physical presence of foreign troops is what really stimulates recruitment for the Taliban. But there just isn't empirical evidence that shows that the mere deaths themselves, isolated from the fact that they're caused by Americans, has the cause and effect that people would like to think. Christine Fair, Georgetown professor, has written an interesting thing about Pakistan and the effect of drone strikes. And she basically says Pakistanis haven't liked us for decades, and fewer drone strikes don't make a difference. This is a very interesting article because what Professor Zani did is he did a study, and he came up with some interesting facts here. And basically it says, as drone strikes went down in Pakistan, anti-Americanism went up. And anti-Americanism went up in countries, most strikingly, in countries where there weren't any drone strikes. This is something else you don't usually see. With using ground troops, great article by Mark Bowden, and it's not all favorable to drones, but it's worth reading. It's one I give to my students because it's kind of balanced. But I think he's right with this. When you got to fight your way in and fight your way out, you're going to kill a lot of people. That's the fact. And in these places where these drone strikes are, you're fighting your way in and fighting your way out. I thought this is interesting. In Pakistan, drone strikes go down, civilian casualties go up. When Tony was talking about General McChrystal's restriction on airstrikes, there were, a year later, fewer civilian deaths from airstrikes. But civilian casualties overall were up 31%. So if you don't kill the adversary and you don't kill the source that's killing most of the civilians, then they're going to live on to kill. Some of the criticisms I really want to start racing here because I know I'm on a deadline. Amnesty International. You would think that was a quote, wouldn't you? Actually, when you dig down in the freaking footnotes, you'll see that, we didn't really get to talk to any women. But we're going to put a woman on the cover a young woman, even though we didn't really talk to them. And I think if they did, maybe women would have a different view of killing the Taliban. And if you know David Axe, he's no friend particularly of the military, but he is a pretty smart guy. And he really takes them to task, especially here. Remember that slide way back of the British? They fly so high that nobody can. So if you ever read something where they say, oh, yes, the sound of drones keeps my family up, you know he's lying because he's not hearing drones. They're flying at altitudes that you're not going to hear them. If you ever hear anybody saying they're flying in pairs, they don't fly in pairs. You know why? Because you can't keep them from crashing into each other, because you don't have that kind of situational awareness if you're flying from Las Vegas. And like this guy doesn't even realize that there's a drone up there. Human Rights Watch. And a different guy, Joshua Faust, took a look at this. You would think based on that title it was about drones, right? Actually, the biggest single incident that they discuss in there wasn't a drone strike at all. It was a missile strike. And because of that missile strike, not launched from a drone, probably from a submarine, we don't use those kinds of weapons anymore because they don't have the continuous eyes on target that a drone has. And a lot of times they confuse it with, it's hard to believe, but it's not hard to believe actually, but when you get out in very rural areas, these people don't know the difference between a drone, an airplane, a helicopter. They know something's flying up there and kind of shooting at them. And most recently, last week, the Open Society, now we could have a whole 3-beer discussion on the Open Society Foundation and George Soros and everything else, but they came out with a report where they looked at 9 incidents where 26 civilians were killed, but they don't tell you who the people were they interviewed because they say it's a security issue. At the same time, they go after the U.S. government for not revealing everything about drone strikes because of security. I mean, there's either transparency or there isn't transparency. So nobody will have the capability of independently verifying this. The guy who I went to ask for his view is Christopher Swift. Some of you guys know him. He's a little nuts. He does a lot of groundwork in Yemen. And he sent me an email, and he was a little bit fired up about this thing. And he basically says, and there's some stuff I didn't put up here. I did ask Christopher if I could use this here. But he points out that some of the deficiencies. And the day after it came out, there's a drone strike in Yemen, and it killed an important guy, a guy that's going, and we need to keep the pressure on them. So I always ask people, okay, who is going to be, if you let this guy live, who's going to be responsible for the people he kills? The problem is it's demonstrating that. Effectiveness article, study that was done by a guy from Stanford and I think a guy from RAND makes a long report to make a point that they actually help in Afghanistan. And getting back to that article I cited before, and the analysis is that it's not just killing the guys. I think it's the psychological impact because it is injecting fear. And from a military perspective, you want to inject fear in the mind of the adversary because it makes him do things that aren't going to be efficient. And, of course, the president, who presumably has better information than we are. Quick look at cyber warfare. DOD, it's really amazing because it wasn't that long ago. You weren't even allowed to even hint that there's such a thing as offensive cyber war. Now we have the chief of Cybercom coming out talking about it. The big issue here is what is force in cyber world? And it is important because it depends on what kind of legal regime applies, either international human rights law or international law of armed conflict. And we see this manifested. Remember the Sony thing? The president came out and said, well, no, it wasn't a cyber attack, it was cyber vandalism, because he doesn't want to say it's an attack. There's other people who say, no, that was an attack. Actually, there's lots of things, this is from the UN Charter, that don't constitute a use of armed force. Because remember, that's what you have to have, in theory, to kick in Article 51, the right of self-defense. And this was an interesting article. Are we at the point that we should go to war because somebody takes down Facebook? Interestingly enough, the guy says, well, maybe. But I think it's better understood if, suppose that the stock market gets taken down. See, the law is built on the idea of violence or destruction being an attack. So just this mishmashing of data, a lot of people would say. I'd say the norm, though, is evolving. If it has that kind of a drastic effect, we will see that considered act of war. The Tallinn Manual it was sponsored by NATO. It's not an official NATO document, but if you want one book, and it's available in paperback, that will give you the law of cyber war as it exists today, it's probably the Tallinn Manual. And what they say, if the effect is the same as if you blew something up, then it's an attack, even though it's accomplished by cyber means. One thing about self-defense and the anticipatory self-defense, and this is the evolving norm, you see normally in the old days when we had the Caroline case, you could see while the enemy Navy is approaching the shore. But in this world, in the 21st century, you don't know. So now you're seeing a different evaluation of what imminence is involved and when you can appropriately take action. And this is highly debated. And they use the example of a logic bomb. If it's about to go off, it's probably an attack. If it's just in the system waiting for some further, it's probably not enough imminence. Anyway, non-state actors, we see this, is it the state doing it, meaning is it the country? If the country is controlling those non-state actors, the country's responsible. But we're seeing more and more of individuals doing it, and this is the most recent. This is extraordinarily dangerous because if you're on the receiving end, you may not know exactly who did it. And how about our civilians? Can they wage cyber war? Well, actually, they can. It isn't illegal under international law for a civilian to directly participate in armed conflict. The problem is, they lose their protection that they might otherwise have if they're a bona fide combatant. But what's direct participation? Well, according to the ICRC, launching a computer network attack is a direct participation. So what's the consequences of that? Well, actually, the civilian can be targeted like a combatant. And I have a feeling that a lot of them don't know that they could be attacked in their home and on the same basis as a military member would be. Attribution. Secretary Panetta gave an astonishing speech, at least astonishing to me. He says that DoD now has the capacity to locate and hold accountable people who conduct cyber attacks. Interestingly enough, there is a podcast on the Lawfare blog, which Steve's one of the founding persons. I don't know, Steve, you're involved in so many things. You founded that, whatever. I just heard a podcast from Steptoe and Johnson with a company named CrowdStrike, where basically they said if you throw enough resources at it, you're going to solve the attribution issue, and nation states can do that. What about this? Well, there's another interesting article in Atlantic that raised the idea, well, no, if you conduct a cyber attack, you're going to have to put some kind of marker in it so people will know who did it. Let's see, what are the chances of a treaty on this? The word zero comes to mind. And it won't just be the United States, although it would be the United States. A couple quick things about new dimension of war. We have not traditionally thought of propaganda as a use of force. There are some exceptions to that, but we're seeing it. I haven't read this whole thing. The Danish military, it's on the web for free. You can download it. It's about 150 pages. It's the weaponization of social media, and I think it's exactly right. And they have a little bit of experience over there in Denmark because a couple of years ago, somebody hacked in and started sending hate mail to the families of deployed Danish soldiers. Ironically, in last fall, we saw the same thing kind of happening to our own troops. And coincidentally, I just written an article about this. I call it the hyper-personalization of war. And I thought I was going to have a visit from people I don't want to have a visit from. And I'm not talking about the enemy other than our own security people. But it's probably not a violation of the law to send a personal email to somebody's mother and say, we're going to kill your daughter tomorrow. We know where she is. We're going to kill her tomorrow unless you go out and demonstrate against the war. Probably not illegal, but maybe it should be. We're seeing the capability now to personalize propaganda in that way. I think it's a changing dynamic. A couple of quick things about the future of war. U.S. technological superiority, not so much. And Bob Work, I think, articulates what a lot of people inside are saying. We are losing our edge. Pentagon recently talked about renewing the nuclear force. Did you know that the average plane in the Air Force is 28 and a half years old? How many people, and this is from 2013, would let their son or daughter drive on the Beltway in a 55-year-old car? I don't think too many. That's what we're asking 21, 22, 23-year-olds. And even the stealth bomber is now 22 years old. Super soldiers. Real quickly on this, there are two of these things that I think are interesting. Those two capacities, threat detection and thought helmets, are capitalizing on the electricity that a brain generates. I'm not smart enough to explain it any more than that. But I do think it raises all kinds of issues because they now have the capability of tracking and reading things into it. This, I thought, was really astonishing. It wasn't about the military, but you can readily see the military applications. This is what this guy said, and he's working on stuff. And when we start thinking about the kinds of things, drugs, implants, exoskeletons, that's nothing, I think, compared to this. Changing gene manipulation to create a super soldier. I can't even wrap my head around all the ethical issues that would be raised. Do we have to have waterboarding in the future? No, we don't, actually. Because, and my colleague at Duke, Nita Farahani, has written a couple things on this. They now have a way of, they track your brain and they can ask you questions and they can tell what the answers are. You don't say a word just by your brain activity. And I think this so waterboarding might be a historical, interesting point, but I think this is the future of interrogation. Autonomous weapons systems, really, really quickly. DoD policy right now is that you have to have a human in the loop. But what is a human in the loop? When you start thinking we have a bunch of systems like the CWIS, it's a fully autonomous weapon. It has to be because it tracks missiles coming out of ship faster than a human being could possibly do it. And believe me, you don't want to be around that thing because it's slewing around. And the Patriot missile system has a fully autonomous mode. These are systems that have been around for 30 years. And sensor fused weapons. This weapon comes down. It has a radar in it, and it looks for what a actually Soviet-designed tank looks like, or armored vehicle. And then it has it's called dual phenomenology. It has another sensor in there that looks for the heat signature of Russian engines. And when those things coalesce, it fires at it. Some of the criticism, Malinowski is really a pretty good guy. I was shocked that he came out with this because it was really an embarrassing piece of work for Mike Schmidt actually took him apart. Mike Schmidt is the guy on autonomous weapon systems and cyber, and he's at the Naval War College. So they tried again in April, 2 weeks ago. I haven't read this whole thing. I read part of it. It is embarrassing in terms of what the law is, because they evidently don't know what the law is. And because what they say is, you can't have autonomous weapons because no individual can be held accountable. That's what they say in the beginning. But when they get it, it's very hard to hold them accountable. Well, lots of things in life are hard. It doesn't mean that you don't do them. And I think the book on killer robots comes up with the right answer of who you hold accountable. And if I do say so myself, I wrote an article. This was actually about DUIs, and the idea in the military, we have a negligent homicide, a negligence standard, which criminalized simple negligence. And the reason is because the military has such dangerous things. You have to have a way of coercing accountability for even simple negligent. So I think there's plenty of law to hold people accountable. Nuclear weapons, I just want to, one last thing on this, because it really struck me in a couple of our presentations. The International Court of Justice, which does advisory opinions, came up with an advisory opinion 2 decades ago on nuclear weapons. And here they go through 500 pages. That's the way these things. And the very last page, they say, they go through, these things can never be lawful, unethical, blah, blah, blah. But, the very last line. So there is a difference between existential war and other kinds of conflicts. And it's interesting, they say, not extreme circumstance, not a genocide or something, the survival of the state. And there's lots of states out there. They don't say democratic states or non-totalitarian. And non-proliferation treaty, very successful, but let's take a look at what happened in the Ukraine. Ukraine at one point was like the third leading nuclear power, and they actually had uranium mines, they had reactor facilities, they built missiles, and they had launch facilities. They were autarkic, I think that's the word. And they gave it all up because there was an agreement where the U.S. and the Russian Federation agreed to respect their borders. Went totally out the window. It's not technically legally binding, but what does that tell the rest of the world when you don't live up to what you said you were going to do? You know, there's never been a war between two nuclear-armed countries. And who knows what interesting interview with Putin. He said, I was going to, when we were doing I was going to put nuclear forces on alert. Who knows what that guy would do? Finally, I thought this was kind of interesting. Just came out last week. There are actually people studying. And by the way, there's a law review article on planetary defense. But actually, even a relatively small asteroid is like 30 Hiroshimas. So there's a physicist at Harvard who's working on this. And the ironic thing is, he's come to the conclusion that nuclear weapons are the only thing that could save the planet from an asteroid. I'm not enough of a physicist to know if that's... And finally, you got to read this article by Ian Morris. I've met the guy. He's really interesting. Because what he says is, war has done a lot of good things. It's reduced the level of violence. It's made us richer. And now he says it's disinventing itself. His argument in this part isn't very good because he says, well, if there's a war, it would probably be a nuclear war. And history says we've always avoided Armageddon. Ergo, war is a good thing. The last part of this, I think the first part of his argument is interesting. This is Dunlap's view of the world. And finally, this is what I tell my students, and I know people here will and probably should disagree with this view. I do think that force has to be used. I don't think we're anywhere near a point where we would be able to completely avoid the use of force, legal or ethical basis. And finally, let me just go back. This is Rosa Brooks. She's a law professor at Georgetown. I commend this article to you, whether you agree with her or not, because basically what she says is, this is going to be with us. The threat of terrorism is going to be with us. We have to start accommodating it. This structure, legal, ethical structure, has always been built on this idea that a war would be a finite, World War II, you begin it and then at some point it's over. This is never going to be over, and we should stop kidding ourselves and accept the fact that we are in forever war. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Well, I guess one of the conclusions of that talk is that whatever the dilemmas of war in the past have been, they pale before the dilemmas of the future that you have now opened our eyes on. We'll open it up for questions, and we'll begin with you right over there.
David Williams from Northside High School in Fort Worth, Texas. Okay, from your initial part of the presentation on drones, my mind got to wondering about, for instance, domestic terrorism, Timothy McVeigh, early 90s. If we had the technology, from what you're saying, from the law perspective and then from your personal perspective, would the United States have the right to take him out when he's driving from Fort Riley down to Oklahoma City on Interstate 35?
If that was the only way of saving somebody's life, an innocent person's life, I don't care if they use a sniper, a drone, or whatever, or ram them with a car. There's lots of ways of doing it. I don't think we should focus on the weapon system. I think we should focus on what the need for the use of force is. And if the use of force is otherwise lawful, then I'm fine with whatever other lawful use of force there could be. We're not going to see that because I think that those circumstances would be so rare, it just would not be smart policing. But I would not say any otherwise lawful weapon ought not be used to save somebody's life, in my opinion.
Richard Vandenbosch from Modesto Junior College.
Thank you very much for that whirlwind presentation. My question had to do with Pakistan. The Prime Minister has condemned the use of drones within the sovereign space of Pakistan. The Supreme Court there has done the same thing. So I guess my question is, why are they not shooting down more drones? Obviously, we understand the PR aspect. But and the second part of the question is, to what degree is the United States developing stealth technology in regards to drones? I mean, obviously they're getting smaller. Is there any effort to create, if they do become micro drones, could they still shoot those out of the sky?
Well, I think the way weapons work, I'll answer the second one. There will always be a reaction to a weapon. And I'm sure that there are smart people now working on anti-drone systems. Some anti-drone systems want to jam the communication. And that's one reason why the drones that we have, we could not use against a real adversary like China, because you can jam that. Remember that all those signals? The technology of destruction is easier to put in place than the technology of construction. And we've gone in this country to a lot of expense to make sure we can communicate during a nuclear war with our bombers, and that is very hard to do and very expensive. So I think that there are some real problems, but there's some potentials. You saw recently that a laser weapon was deployed on a Navy ship in the Persian Gulf. I think laser weapons will also be used to counter drones. In fact, they're designed for cruise missiles, and so I think that technology is coming. It'll be countered by increasingly smaller and smaller weaponized drones, to the point where you'll have one of those little drones that you could hold on your finger that's just designed to go right in your eye or something like this. And it might somehow be equipped with facial recognition software. So it will just go looking for you. And that's what I talk about in my article. Now, why isn't Pakistan shooting down more drones? Because they like what they're... Dunlap's view, I have no inside knowledge. I think they like what's happening. Because they tried to send their troops up there. Have you ever been up to that part of Pakistan? It is, no matter what you think about, like, that is really wild country. They sent their own troops up there, and they were killing civilians all over the place, not because they wanted to, but it was just the difficulty of trying to, get the enemy out of there. So I think that but they can't for political reasons. That's why it's covert action. It won't be acknowledged. But yes, I personally believe they could shoot down every drone we have.
Colonel Randy Lanning.
Thank you, sir, for a great presentation. I was really taken back with all these new types of warfare, and I was concerned, or I wanted to ask you, sir, both from a legal standpoint and for your professional military standpoint, are you concerned at all about loss of effective command and control over all these new systems?
I think that we really need to be concerned about that because, and I was having a discussion with somebody kind of related to this. The fad thing now is to push, command down to the lowest level, decision-making down to the lowest level. And that works in industry and everything else. But the problem now is we have increasingly lethal systems that you need to be very careful about who you give the authority. And because now, in the My Lai massacre, you're basically talking about some young soldiers under extreme stress using their personal weapons. Now you have a young soldier on the ground, a JTAC, who can call in a B-52 strike. And there's basically not going to be anybody who's going to question him on it. It's presumably he's trained and everything else. So I think commanding adversaries are going to want to disrupt our command and control. That's why space warfare is the next big thing. And so they're going to try to disrupt it. But I think it's also, even if we have command and control, maintaining that balance between, micromanaging and making sure that the right strategic decisions are made is going to be very difficult because of the increased lethality of weapons that are now available, more widely available. It's not just an M16, it's, a drone fleet or something like this.
Ron Keller.
Since there is such a division, a disparity between international law and U.S. policy at times, when is it practical or wise, or is it ever? International law, I think, has a place to at least govern rules of law, even though rogue nations don't do that. We don't want to be a rogue nation ourselves, but when is it benefit us to not submit ourselves to international law, considering we don't have to? We have a U.S. Constitution, which is our law.
Well, I think the international law the law of war, let me just give you my own experience. In my 34 years, I many more times had to tell commanders, no, the law doesn't prohibit that. They had a much more restricted view of what the law prevented them from doing. And sometimes, honestly, I kind of think they wanted me to say it was illegal because they kind of didn't want to do it for one reason or another. But so international law really doesn't constrain us. It is rules of engagement and policies that we put in place. Now, I do have an exception to that. I wrote something on the Just Security blog not too long ago about weapons treaties. I think we should focus on the basic law of armed conflict, which requires distinction, proportionality, chivalry, humanity, those basics, and not go after specific weapons. Why? Let me give you an example. The laser, the international law against blinding lasers. Did you know it's perfectly legal to incinerate somebody with a laser, But if you design a weapon that is merely going to blind them, that's a war crime. And you use that if it's intended to blind somebody. But you can incinerate them. Cluster munitions. Oh, no, and it is a problem with the failure rate of submunitions. But when I was first in the military, cluster munitions were the humane answer, because the scenario was the enemy has put everything on the roof of the hospital or on a dam. So you have a choice. Are you going to drop a bomb in the dam or in the hospital? No, you use a cluster munition, which isn't going to penetrate typically a roof, but it's going to knock everything off the roof and kill everybody up there. But most countries have banned cluster munitions. Landmines. You know, David Koplow has written a book. He's a law professor at Georgetown, where he basically says, you know, the Ottawa Convention against landmines was based on dumb landmines, meaning landmines that were not like the ones we use, which are self-neutralizing. They're only good for a certain period of time, and they have various things. Well, that's we have a weapon. It's called a Gator mine system, where you drop it on. It's a runway denial. You drop it on a runway, and it drops these anti-tank mines. But it has 22 anti-personnel mines. They're supposed to kill the guys who are coming on to try to take the landmines off. But it doesn't rupture the runway, and they turn themselves off after a couple days. Why is that important? If you're using force in the 21st century, you have to think about, okay, what do we do after the war? How do we find relief supplies? How does the country get their economy back? If you know what they have to do in Britain? They use a runway penetrator, and it goes through 6 feet of concrete. It ruptures it because you see on TV, they just fill in the holes. And no, that's not the way it works. It goes down through 6 feet of concrete, and it ruptures it, so it takes 18 months to rebuild that runway. Okay, what's going to happen in those 18 months? But that's the choice they have. We used to use mines, air-delivered mines, around tunnels to keep people from using tunnels. Well, nobody wants us to do that, so what have we invented? Thermobaric weapons. Fuel-air explosives, perfectly legal. Fuel-air explosive puts this mist into the air, and then it ignites it, and it sucks up the oxygen so quickly it pulls your lung from your chest wall. So you bleed to death if you're not killed in the blast. That's perfectly legal. But a landmine, and it is tragic, but there's never been incidents, according to David Koplow, of people being killed by modern self-neutralizing landmines. But the way the treaty is written, it doesn't distinguish between the two. So I think we have to be very strict in adhering to the fundamentals of the law of armed conflict, but be very cautious about engaging in demonizing specific weapons, because it's always a snapshot in time of what the technology can or cannot do. There's a guy who wrote an article in the Harvard Technology Review or something like this about, one of the big problems we have in developing non-lethal or low-lethal weapons is the Biological Weapons Convention. Because did you know you can't use tear gas as a means or method of warfare? So what happened in the first Gulf War? Iraqis in trenches, they won't surrender. In another world, you might throw tear gas in there and force them out. What the Army did, they put a plow in a tank, they plowed them all under, buried them alive. Perfectly legal. Is that is that more egregious than tear gas? So, you understand why people, and people talk about the slippery slope. And that is a concern. But there's also slippery slope on the logic of law. Meaning, if people start saying, wait a second, you mean we can bury a guy alive, but we can't use tear gas? To Joe Sixpack, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And that erodes the confidence that people want to have, in my judgment, in the law.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.